Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the Court. The Ninth Circuit held that Daimler, a foreign corporation, is subject to general jurisdiction in California and thus may be sued in California on any claim arising anywhere in the world. The Ninth Circuit reached this conclusion by attributing to Daimler the California contacts of a Daimler subsidiary, Mercedes-Benz USA, a separate corporation that respects all corporate formalities and that is not Daimler's alter ego. The Ninth Circuit's approach violates due process.
Do we have to reach that question? I mean, I guess the Ninth Circuit must have been interpreting the long-arm statute of California, right?
That's correct, Justice Scalia.
Now, were there California cases that disregarded the corporate form?
California respects the corporate form. The Ninth Circuit applied what appears to be a federal common law of agency that the Ninth Circuit admittedly developed solely for purposes of the jurisdictional inquiry.
But the jurisdictional inquiry is conducted on the basis of the California statute, isn't it?
It is, but at the same time, the California statute extends to the limit of due process. And so what the Ninth Circuit did was it construed what the permissible outer bounds of the due process clause was in this context.
I see. It's California's reference to the outer bounds of jurisdiction that causes this to be a constitutional case.
That's correct, Justice Scalia.
There's nothing in the Constitution, is there, that would prohibit a state from adopting a rule that a parent is responsible for any acts of a wholly owned subsidiary?
Well, Mr. Chief Justice, there may be a constitutional limit, certainly to the extent that, say, California adopted a rule that said for purposes of some sort of liability, we are going to disregard the corporate form. I think that could pose due process concerns to the extent that it is purporting to override, say, the corporate law of Delaware.
Well, even on a prospective basis, your brief talks about notice and fairness and predictability. But if California said going forward, this is the rule that we're going to apply, is there any constitutional problem with that?
I still think there would be, Mr. Chief Justice. In other words, I take Your Honor's point about fair notice if California said going forward, this is the rule we're going to apply. But at the same time, I'm not quite sure what in the Constitution would empower, say, California to essentially override, say, Delaware's corporate law and say, for our state purposes, we're essentially going to rewrite the corporate DNA of a corporation that's chartered in Delaware in order to
We permitted that in Container Corp.
I beg your pardon, Your Honor?
We permitted that in Container Corp. We permitted California law to tax the parent California corporation for the earnings of all its foreign subsidiaries. And we said the due process clause wasn't offended by that.
Well, Justice Sotomayor, typically this Court has applied a less rigorous due process standard in the tax cases than it has in the personal jurisdiction cases. If one were to look at, say, Goodyear or McIntyre, of any of this Court's more recent jurisdictional decisions, it typically takes a much more rigorous view of the due process clause's limits on a sovereign's ability to adjudicate matters that arise outside the forum than it has in the tax context.
We would never get to this question if you hadn't conceded that there is general jurisdiction over the U.S. Subsidiary, over, MBUSA.
Well, Justice Ginsburg, I respectfully disagree that we conceded the point below. I'm not sure, frankly, that we could concede something like that on behalf of a different corporation that's not a party to this lawsuit. But it is true that we focused on the attribution question in the Ninth Circuit. And at the end of the day, I don't think that that point affects the outcome in this case. Because
well, if there were nothing to attribute, then that would be the end of it. If there was not general jurisdiction over MBUSA, that would be the end of the case, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would. That would be one way to resolve the case. Another way to resolve the case.
But we can't resolve it that way since you didn't challenge the general jurisdiction over the subsidiary.
Well, again, we did not argue that point. Instead, we focused on the attribution issue. But at the same time,
I'm sorry, please.
I was going to say, Your Honor, at the same time, I do think that that notion that MBUSA was subject to general jurisdiction in California was necessarily part of the Ninth Circuit's holding. So I do think it is properly preserved for this Court's review if the Court elected to resolve this case on that ground.
And, Mr. Dupree, even if you waived that point, if I understand it correctly, you did not waive the point that even with all attribution in the world, there still is no general jurisdiction over Daimler. In other words, you could attribute all MBUSA's contacts, and you still would not have general jurisdiction over Daimler. Is that right?
Justice Kagan, that is exactly right.
So in that sense, it really doesn't depend on the attribution standard, all these hard questions of is it an alter ego test or is it an agency test, and how does the Constitution relate to state law, because we could apply any test we wanted, and there still wouldn't be general jurisdiction over Daimler in California.
Justice Kagan, that certainly would be an acceptable route for this Court to resolve the case. And Your Honor has it exactly right in that even if one were to attribute the constitutional contacts of MBUSA to Daimler, you would still be left with a joint enterprise that plainly is not at home in the state of California. It would still be a German corporation headquartered in Stuttgart that draws only approximately 2% of its overall vehicle revenue from California sales. So, yes.
Is that a
How do foreign countries resolve this attribution question? Would we be standing alone, or are there a lot of other countries that assert jurisdiction over the parent if there is general jurisdiction over the sub?
By and large, Justice Scalia, most other countries respect the corporate form, and that includes